In 1907, Jesse Livermore made a fortune so large that newspapers across the country printed his name next to the word genius. He had just single-handedly out-traded the most powerful banking coalition in American history. He was 29 years old, worth millions, and considered by many to be the greatest living speculator on Wall Street. Within 18 months, almost all of that money was gone. Not because the market turned against him in some unpredictable way. Not because of a crash he failed to see coming. Jesse Livermore lost a fortune because he let another man talk him out of the exact system that had made him rich in the first place. This is the story of Percy Thomas, a once legendary cotton trader who had already gone bankrupt multiple times, and how he managed to convince the most disciplined speculator in America to abandon his own rules, chase a single massive position, and watch millions of dollars evaporate in a matter of months. If episode 2 taught us that Livermore had the discipline to know when to stop, this episode is about to show you exactly what happens when that discipline disappears and why it can happen to anyone, no matter how skilled they are. Welcome back to the Livermore Ledger. This is episode 3. By early 1908, Jesse Livermore was, by any measure, at the peak of his career. His profits from the panic of 1907 had made him one of the wealthiest independent traders in the country. He had a reputation that opened doors most speculators could only dream of. Bankers wanted to meet him. Journalists wanted to interview him. Other traders wanted to copy his every move. This kind of success creates a particular kind of danger, one that has nothing to do with market conditions and everything to do with psychology. When you've just had the biggest win of your life, using a system you built yourself through years of failure and refinement, it becomes almost impossible to imagine that you could be wrong again. Livermore, for the first time in his career, started to believe his own legend. It was in this state of mind, confident, flush with cash, and increasingly convinced of his own infallibility, that Livermore crossed paths with a man named Percy Thomas. Percy Thomas was not a nobody. In fact, at one point he had been one of the most respected cotton traders in America, known for his deep knowledge of agricultural markets and his ability to speak about cotton supply and demand with an authority that few could match. But Thomas had a history that should have been a warning sign. He had gone bankrupt not once, but multiple times, wiped out by the very market he claimed to understand better than anyone alive. By the time he met Livermore, Thomas was looking for a way back into the game. He didn't have the capital to trade at scale anymore. What he had was persuasive skill, deep cotton market knowledge, and a talent for building compelling, detailed arguments about where prices were headed next. Here's what makes this part of Livermore's story so important for every trader watching this video. Percy Thomas wasn't a con man in the traditional sense. He wasn't lying to Livermore or manipulating him through trickery. He was doing something far more dangerous. He was offering Livermore a compelling, detailed, intellectually satisfying narrative about the cotton market. Livermore's entire trading philosophy, up to this point, had been built on reading price action directly. He watched the tape. He watched how stocks and commodities actually behaved, not how someone theorized they should behave. This price-first approach was the exact foundation of everything that had made him successful, from his chalkboard days in Boston to his short line during the panic of 1907. Percy Thomas offered him something completely different, a fundamental, narrative-driven case for why cotton prices were about to rise dramatically. Thomas talked about crop conditions, weather patterns, supply shortages, and global demand trends. He built an intricate, sophisticated argument, the kind that sounds impressive in conversation and feels intellectually rigorous, even when it isn't grounded in what the market is actually telling you in real time. Livermore, flush with confidence from his 1907 triumph, found himself drawn in. He began spending significant time with Thomas, absorbing his cotton market theories, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, shifting away from the price action first approach that had defined his entire career. He started trading cotton based on Thomas's fundamental narrative rather than on what the tape was actually showing him. This is one of the most important warning signs in trading psychology, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. The danger usually isn't an obviously bad idea. The danger is a well-constructed, intelligent-sounding narrative that pulls you away from the process that actually made you successful in the first place. Livermore began building a long position in cotton, betting that prices would rise based largely on Thomas's fundamental analysis. And here's where things started to go wrong in a way that should feel familiar if you've been following this series. The price action wasn't actually confirming the thesis. Remember Livermore's own principle from episode 2. Never argue with the tape. The market doesn't care about your opinion. It only cares about what it's actually doing. This had been the exact rule that allowed him to build his fortune methodically during the Panic of 1907, adding to winning positions and cutting losing ones without emotional attachment. But now, under the influence of Thomas's compelling fundamental case, Livermore began doing the opposite. As cotton prices failed to rally the way the fundamental narrative predicted, instead of reading that as the market disagreeing with his position, he began interpreting it as a temporary anomaly noise that would resolve itself once the real fundamentals played out. He started adding to his losing position rather than cutting it. This is, without exaggeration, the single most dangerous thing a trader can do, adding size to a position because you believe you're right, rather than because the market is confirming that you're right. It is the exact inversion of the discipline that made Livermore successful in every previous chapter of his career. Cotton prices continued to move against him, and rather than stepping back, cutting his losses, and reassessing the exact behavior that had defined his best trading in 1907, Livermore kept adding to the position, increasingly certain that the market would eventually catch up to what he and Thomas believed was the obvious fundamental truth. The losses accumulated steadily, then dramatically. Livermore was fighting the tape directly, holding and adding to a position that the market was actively telling him was wrong, based on a narrative that felt intellectually compelling but wasn't supported by actual price behavior. By the time Livermore finally recognized what was happening, that he had abandoned the exact system that made him successful, the damage was severe. Historical accounts suggest he lost the vast majority of the fortune he had built during the Panic of 1907, somewhere in the range of several $1,000,000, an almost unthinkable sum for the era. What makes this collapse particularly painful to study isn't just the size of the loss. It's the fact that Livermore had, less than 2 years earlier, demonstrated a masterclass in exactly the opposite behavior. During the 1907 panic, he built his short position incrementally, based purely on price confirmation, and had the discipline to stop the moment his edge reached its natural limit. In the cotton market, he did the precise opposite. He built a position based on narrative conviction rather than price confirmation, and kept adding to a loser instead of cutting it. The lesson here isn't that Percy Thomas was some uniquely gifted manipulator. The uncomfortable truth is that Livermore did this to himself. He allowed a compelling story to override a proven process. And critically, this wasn't a failure of intelligence or market knowledge. Livermore possessed both in abundance. It was a failure of discipline, triggered by overconfidence following his biggest win. This is where Livermore's cotton disaster teaches us something that most trading education completely misses. The most dangerous moment in a trader's career often isn't right after a big loss. It's right after a big win. After a significant loss, most traders become appropriately cautious. They question their assumptions. They tighten their risk management. Fear, uncomfortable as it is, actually serves a protective function. But after a massive win, especially one as dramatic and publicly celebrated as Livermore's performance during the Panic of 1907, the opposite psychological shift happens. Confidence turns into overconfidence. A trader starts to believe that their judgment alone is enough, that they no longer need the same level of confirmation from the market that they required before. This is exactly the psychological state Percy Thomas walked into, and exactly why his narrative-driven pitch found such fertile ground. There's a second lesson buried in this story that's just as important: the danger of switching your process under the influence of someone else's system, especially when that person presents their approach with confidence and sophistication. Thomas wasn't necessarily wrong that fundamentals matter in commodity markets over the long run. The problem was that Livermore abandoned his own proven, price-confirmed methodology in favor of someone else's narrative-based approach, without any track record of that approach actually working for him personally. This connects directly to something we discussed in episode 1. Knowing the rules is not the same as following them. Livermore knew intellectually that you should never argue with the tape. He had proven it himself, spectacularly, just months earlier. And yet, under the influence of confidence and a compelling narrative, he broke his own rule almost immediately. Here's something that makes Jesse Livermore's story even more remarkable, and honestly, more useful to study than almost any other trader in history. The cotton disaster was not a one-time mistake he learned from and never repeated. This exact cycle, spectacular win, followed by overconfidence, followed by an eventual collapse, would repeat itself multiple times throughout his career. Livermore would go on to rebuild his fortune again after the cotton losses. He would have other legendary trades ahead of him, including his famous short position during the market crash of 1929, which we'll cover in a future episode. But he would also experience additional periods of overconfidence and rule-breaking that led to further losses, ultimately dying broke despite having made and lost several fortunes throughout his life. This pattern is worth sitting with because it reveals something uncomfortable about trading discipline. It isn't a switch you flip once and then have forever. It's not a skill, like riding a bicycle, that once learned stays permanently intact. Discipline has to be actively maintained, and it is most vulnerable to breaking down precisely when you'd least expect it, in the immediate aftermath of your biggest successes. Let's bring this back to something you can actually use, because the Percy Thomas story isn't just historical drama, it's a warning that applies directly to anyone trading markets today. The most dangerous trades you'll ever make often won't come from ignorance. They'll come after a big win, when you're confident, when someone presents you with a compelling, intelligent-sounding case that pulls you away from the process that actually got you there. The narrative will feel sophisticated. It might even be partially true. But if it's asking you to abandon price confirmation in favor of a story, no matter how convincing that story sounds, you are walking directly into the same trap that cost Jesse Livermore millions of dollars in 1908. Here's the question worth asking yourself after every big win. Am I about to make my next decision based on what the market is actually telling me, or based on a story I've become emotionally attached to? If episode 1 taught us that knowing the rules isn't enough, and episode 2 taught us that knowing when to stop is its own skill, episode 3 adds perhaps the most important lesson of the entire series. Your discipline is most fragile, exactly when you feel most confident. Guard it accordingly. If this breakdown hit home for you, hit subscribe, because next episode we're jumping forward to 1929, the trade that made Jesse Livermore one of the richest men in America during the single greatest market crash in history, and the psychological state that allowed him to call it in advance, just as he had done in 1907. Drop a comment. Have you ever abandoned your own process because someone else's story sounded more convincing than what the data was actually telling you? I read every single one, and I'll be responding to the best ones in next week's video. This has been the Livermore Ledger. The tape doesn't care how confident you are. It only cares what it's actually doing. I'll see you in the next one.